President Trump's budget proposal is already facing bipartisan resistance in Congress. The proposed budget reportedly calls for a sharp increase in defense spending, tens of billions in reductions to the EPA and State Department, but does not call for any cuts to Social Security or Medicare. Senator Lindsey Graham doubled down on his criticism of the proposal in a town hall hosted by CNN Wednesday. The senator lambasted the president on his suggested cuts to foreign aid.
This is the hardest part about being a politician in war. People get tired. The bottom line is we got to stick with it on the military side, but the foreign assistance, the State Department, the soft power is the key to winning the war. President Trump, do not destroy soft power because we cannot win through military force alone.
Ilan Goldenberg is in Washington. He's the senior fellow and director of the Middle East Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. He recently wrote an op-ed for Politico magazine titled, "The State Department is Already Running on Fumes." Ilan, thanks for joining us.
Great to be with you.
Well, in your piece, you write, slashing the budget for diplomacy is insane, and that the proposed budget sends an unmistakable message about the Trump team's disdain for diplomacy and foreign aid. As someone who worked in both spheres, at the Pentagon, at the State Department, what are the potential consequences, you think?
Well, there's a number of consequences. I think the first and biggest problem is that the military can't do its job by itself. You know, when I was at the Pentagon, you'd have these military planners sit down and very rigorously go through their plans, but they always had a part of the plan which they said the quote-unquote interagency needs to do this, i.e. the other agencies need to do this, and usually by other agencies they meant the State Department. And those things almost never got done or never got done effectively because the State Department and other agencies in the U.S. government didn't have the resources to do it. So let me give you a couple of examples. We had the war in Afghanistan in 2009, a major surge of military forces was supposed to be associated with what was called the civilian surge, to help with development on the ground, diplomacy, resources to make sure that after you defeat the Taliban and al-Qaeda, you put in place something better so it doesn't come back. That surge never materialized. The military tried to do it itself, and it didn't work. Again, in Iraq, we now have the situation with ISIS. You know, we're talking about defeating them in Mosul, defeating them in Raqqa. But how do we make sure they're not there again in 5 years? We do that by building governing institutions in the aftermath and development and local economics that can actually work. And you need the State Department and you need USAID, that's really the agency that works on development, to do that. And if you're slashing their budgets by 40%, you're not going to get there.
Yeah, and so how significant then, Ilan, are the larger strategic effects of those kinds of examples?
Well, I mean, it's huge. This is why you have 120 generals signing on to a letter saying we need the State Department fully funded. It's why one Secretary of Defense after another keeps talking about the need to fund these programs and these budgets, because they recognize that we're not going to win wars. We're not going to win the peace that comes after the war unless we have a State Department that's fully funded. And I'll tell you, I'll just give you a couple of examples in my own experience, small examples. You know, I worked on one of Secretary Kerry's top priorities, making Middle East peace. But when I was at the State Department, I had to go across the hall just to get to a secure phone to call my colleagues at the Pentagon or at the White House. When I was at the Pentagon, those phones were readily available whenever I needed them. It's a small example, but it's just a fact that the State Department doesn't have nearly the resources that the Pentagon does.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is pretty striking when you spell it out that way. What other kinds of day-to-day impacts could this funding slash have? I mean, the notion of not having a phone that's secure at the ready at Foggy Bottom, where the State Department is headquartered, to some folks would seem to be, hard to believe.
Yeah, well, here's another example. Okay, if there are 44-star generals in the U.S. military, any of them can get an airplane with secure communications to go with them, basically whenever they need it. Meanwhile, at the State Department, the only person who gets that treatment is the Secretary of State. So you have all these diplomats, very senior diplomats, going around the world, doing high-stakes diplomacy, shuttle diplomacy, where they have much more unpredictable travel, where actually the turnaround time between when you have a meeting and when you need to report back to the Secretary is much shorter than it is in the Pentagon, because these State Department negotiations are usually short fuse, very intense, back and forth, much more than at the Pentagon. And none of these people have easy ways to access secure information or get that information back. And also, it's a lot harder for them to travel because they're all flying commercial. So these are small examples. But what fundamentally happens is, at the Pentagon, I always found that if you had a major problem, the first thing you said is, what is the problem? What are the resources we need for that to address that problem? Let's go solve it. At the State Department, there was always, here's the problem. Given our minimal resources, how do we deal with it best we can? And that's just a different attitude in cultures and institutions that reflects then in how effective an agency is going to be in the long term.
Well, there continue to be reports that officials at the State Department, including Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, are being left in the dark and that it's far less busy than usual. What is your sense of morale at this point?
Well, my understanding is it's quite low because it just seems like the White House is going to cut the State Department out of everything. At least that's the plan. This happened before. We saw this a lot in the aftermath of 9/11 and a couple of years afterwards where the White House and the Pentagon really ran foreign policy. One of the reasons that we ended up with the Iraq War, and even then you had a much stronger Secretary of State in Colin Powell, but he was essentially cut out, and much of the State Department bureaucracy, for example, was cut out of the post-war planning for Iraq. And we were, as a result, completely unprepared. The State Department did all these large working groups. They had hundreds of experts doing all this work on how we govern and deal with Iraq in the aftermath. And with one stroke of a pen, Rumsfeld said, no thank you. Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld said, no thank you, we'll just do it ourselves. And they weren't prepared at all. And so this is the danger that you run into when you start sidelining the department completely. I'm not saying the State Department is perfect. It's got many flaws. It's quite frustrating sometimes to work at. But you need to listen to people who really have that kind of political expertise, language expertise, cultural expertise that only Foreign Service officers have.
All right. Ilan Goldenberg in Washington. Ilan, thanks very much for your perspective.
Thank you for having me.